Aristotle's account of the megalocycles ends with a portrait. It describes the man who has a slow gait, a deep voice, who doesn't hurry, who isn't impressed easily, and who carries himself with measured reserve across everything he does in his own life. And we talked about this in the previous video, and we came to the conclusion that none of this is just somehow performative or a style affectation. Instead, this is just what the inner character formation looks like when it has actually done the work over a long period of time. But Aristotle, he leaves something unanswered here, right? He gave us the portrait. He told us that all of this is a result of our character. But what he didn't give us is a systematic explanation of why. Why does the formed soul produce a particular outward expression at all? Why does character express itself in our gait, in our speech, in the way we dress, and in the way we move our bodies? Aristotle, he basically merely gestures at the connection, but he doesn't really articulate it. Thankfully, Cicero picks up where Aristotle left it. In Book 1 of his De Officiis, Cicero develops the systematic philosophy of outward conduct. And the name he gives the principle that governs it all is decorum. Now, decorum is a Latin word whose meaning has faded almost completely in our modern usage. When we use it these days, we tend to mean something like good manners, or social politeness, or the avoidance of social embarrassment. But this isn't really what Cicero means by decorum. For Cicero, decorum translates the Greek prepon, so that which is fitting, appropriate, and properly proportioned to the person, the situation, and of course the moral reality at hand. In other words, decorum is not merely just a code for external behavior. It is the principle by which our inner character becomes visible in our own conduct, in our speech, in how we dress, in how we move, in how we gesture around, and in how we present ourselves publicly. In this sense, decorum is the outward form of virtue. It is what happens when a well-ordered soul expresses itself with measure in the world. Now, Cicero says in his De Officiis that moral rightness and fittingness are so closely bound together that they can hardly be separated in thought, even though they remain distinct in nature. So what is right makes itself recognizable through what is fitting. And this quote-unquote fitting form is how the right makes itself visible. If you take what is right away, then what looks fitting will become just affectation. And if you take the fitting away, then what is right will lose the medium through which it expresses itself in the world. In essence, the two are aspects of the same thing, but neither one can actually substitute for the other, and neither one can exist without the other in a fully formed life. So what Cicero is talking about isn't just how a man should present himself. He is more so telling us in what exact way a virtuous character takes shape when it expresses itself outwardly, and also why this actually follows from our character in the first place. Now, in Book 1 of the De Officiis, Cicero distinguishes between two senses of decorum, and the first sense is general. General decorum is what accompanies every virtuous action. So, whatever a man does well, he does so in a fitting way, and this fittingness is a property of the virtuous action itself. For example, a courageous act is usually performed with a certain bearing. A just act is usually carried out in a certain manner, and a generous act has a particular form or feel to it when it is genuinely generous and not just merely transactional or calculated. In other words, each virtue, when it actually expresses itself in our conduct, takes a more or less specific outward form. And this form is what Cicero calls decorum in the general sense. Now, the second sense is more specific, and this quote-unquote specific decorum is concerned more about one particular domain, which is the outward management of bodily life, of speech, of dress, of bearing, and how a person or a man handles himself in physical space. And this specific decorum belongs especially to the virtue of temperance. And the reason for that is that temperance is the virtue that governs how our appetite and impulses are ordered. And the outward management of the body is where this ordering actually becomes visible to other people. Now, Cicero also says that this specific decorum is what makes a man's conduct actually look freeborn in the Roman sense, and not merely in the legal sense of free birth, but in the moral sense of a man who is governed by reason and who is not driven completely by his appetites. This essentially points to a very specific condition of the soul, where the rational part actually governs the appetitive part. And this governance shows itself in how a man eats, in how he speaks, in how he moves, in how he dresses, and in how he carries himself across the situations of any ordinary day. The outward form here is the visible expression of the inward ordering. And Cicero develops the idea further with his doctrine of the four personae. And with this, he posits that there are clearly things that are fitting for any rational human beings, but there are also things that are fitting for this particular human being or particular man and not any other. Both are real, he says, and the four personae is how Cicero accounts for both. Now, the first persona is the nature we share with all rational beings. This is the universal. It is what makes us human at all. And it is what gives us the basic structure of reason that any human being has. And the decorum that follows from this is the most general. It is what is fitting for any single human being by virtue of actually being human. Acting against this first persona is essentially acting against our own nature in the most basic sense. Then the second persona is the practical nature that is given to each individual. This is what we now sometimes call temperament, but Cicero means it a bit more deeply than just temperament. In his mind, this is the specific endowment of mind, character, and capacity that distinguishes one man from another man. Some men are quick, some men are deliberate, some are quote-unquote extroverted, and some are reserved. But none of these are moral failures or moral excellences in themselves. It is just the raw material each man has been given to work with. And this second persona generates its own decorum, meaning that what is fitting for one man, given who he actually is, may not actually be fitting for another man. And then we have the third persona, and this is the station fortune has placed us in. So the circumstances of our birth, our position in the social order, or as Cicero likes to call it, the office we hold, or the responsibilities that come to us through circumstances instead through our own choices. Now, unlike the first two, this isn't really fixed in the way they are, because circumstance can actually change over time. But while we are in a particular station, that station carries its own decorum. So what is fitting for a magistrate, for example, is not really fitting for a private citizen. Just like what is fitting for a young man learning a profession is not really fitting for the same man 20 years later. Then there is the fourth persona, and this is the role we choose for ourselves. So this is the vocation we adopt, the kind of life we build, and the deliberate orientation we give to our own years or our own decades. This is basically the persona that comes through our own choices instead of through nature, individuality, or circumstances. And this is the persona where the most serious work happens, because choosing well actually requires looking at the prior three honestly. Ideally, we would all choose our vocation in light of our universal nature, our practical temperament, and the station we actually find ourselves in. And the decorum that follows from this fourth persona is the form our chosen life takes when it is lived in accordance with what we actually are. So every man has all four personae operating at once, and what is fitting for him in any specific situation is the result of all four. And reading this result correctly is itself a form of practical wisdom. It is what Aristotle would call phronesis, but applied to the question of one's own expression. So, having said all that, let's talk about some concrete things or areas Cicero actually talked about in relation to his idea of decorum. And he starts with the body. The body, he says, is the most immediate medium through which the soul expresses itself, and decorum applies to every single motion of it. He talks about gait specifically. A man, he says, should not walk too slowly like someone in procession, because that will become just an affectation. And he also says that a man shouldn't walk too fast, like a man rushing, because that actually produces breathlessness, and it distorts the features, and it gives the appearance of being driven by the situation instead of governing it. So the right gait, according to Cicero, is the one that comes from a man whose body is doing what it actually should be doing, which is moving him through space in the right speed for the occasion, neither performing leisure or just being chased by urgency. Then there's gesture. And here, Cicero is mainly focusing on how a man uses his body when he speaks. Cicero is very explicit that exaggerated gesture or excessive expressiveness are both failures of decorum because they suggest that the speech can't really stand on its own and that it needs reinforcement from the body. In his mind, the fitting gesture is simply moderate. It is deliberate and it is in proportion to what is being said. So it is when a man's body cooperates with his speech without overwhelming it that the decorum of the act of conversation or the act of speaking is correct. Then there is the voice. And Cicero treats the modulation of the voice as one of the most important areas of decorum because the voice is where character actually becomes audible. He talks about volume, pace, pitch, and the avoidance of two extremes. And the first extreme is the voice that is just simply too loud or too pressed, which suggests anxiety or overt aggression. And the second extreme is the voice that is simply too thin or too withdrawn, which suggests timidity and invasion. To Cicero, the fitting voice is the one that actually carries the speaker's actual conviction at the volume and the pace the situation requires. It doesn't do more and it doesn't do less. Then there's dress, and on dress, Cicero is especially clear. To him, dress should avoid two opposite errors. And the first error is what he calls effeminacy, by which he means dress that has become elaborate, ornamental, or simply attention-seeking. So dress that exists for its own sake or for the sake of being noticed. And the second error is what he calls rusticity, which is dress that has become too careless, too neglectful, or simply too contemptuous for the occasion. So basically dress that signals disregard for the people one is among or the occasion. Both of these are failures of decorum because both substitute something else for the actual function of dress, which to Cicero is to express the man wearing it in a form that is fitting to his station, to his role, and to the situation he is currently in. The right dress is the dress that lets the man be seen as he actually is, without distortion in either direction. And in this context, Cicero distinguishes between two forms of beauty, which are dignitas and venustas. Dignitas is the beauty that is proper to a man, so the beauty of gravity and seriousness made visible in form. Venustas is the beauty proper to a woman, so the beauty of grace and charm made visible. And these aren't really opposed to each other in some general way. They are simply different, and what is fitting for one isn't really fitting for the other. So to Cicero, a man's outward form should express dignitas. It should express the gravity of a soul that has been formed, and has been formed seriously. On the other hand, the outward form of a man who is reaching for venustas instead has misunderstood what his own beauty actually is, because beauty, for Cicero, is the visible form of an inner condition, and different inner conditions make different visible forms. So to him, the outward form should express the actual person instead of borrowing the form proper to someone else's nature. And from here, decorum also extends to the management of the household, the table, and the conversation. Now, the household should be ordered without being ostentatious, which is what Cicero calls the right scale. It should be neither grander than the man warrants, nor meaner than his station actually calls for. Then the table should be set with proper regard for the guests, but without elaborate excess. The conversations should be modulated to the company. It should be serious when seriousness is actually warranted, and it should be lighter when the occasion calls for more ease. But it should always avoid both pomposity and triviality. Now, none of this is really quote-unquote etiquette in our modern sense. These are not really immutable laws we should follow. They are just some application of the same underlying principle that is stretched across all of these situations. And this principle is proportion. Decorum is what proportion looks like in conduct. The fitting form, or the fitting action, is the one that is in proportion to a specific situation. It is the one that is in proportion to the person that is actually acting and to the moral content of what is actually being done. Excess in either direction is a failure of decorum because both excess and deficiency break the proportion. Being too elaborate is one way to fail, while being too careless is another way to fail. The right form essentially sits in the place where the man's character, his station, current station in life, his current occasion, and the action itself. It is only correct when all of these are in the correct relation with each other. Now, Cicero is also clear that what is fitting will actually change with the situation itself. The decorum of a serious meeting isn't really the decorum that is of a meal shared with friends. And the decorum of a public office isn't necessarily the decorum of private life. So the man of the formed character doesn't just simply apply a fixed style or a fixed way of conduct across every situation in life. Instead, he has to read the occasion and has to meet it with the form it actually calls for. And this reading is itself a form of practical wisdom. The fitting form for any particular moment is something that has to be perceived, and this perception is what years of character formation will have prepared the man to do correctly. Now, if you know your Aristotle, you'll have noticed that everything we have just been discussing is essentially Aristotelian. The principle of proportion that runs through most of Cicero's account is Aristotle's Doctrine of the Mean. So Mesotis of the Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where virtue is essentially described as a kind of middle between two opposite failures. And what Cicero is doing throughout his treatment of decorum is taking this basic principle, or the same doctrine, and carrying it into the visible form of how a man conducts himself in the world. Effeminacy and rusticity in dress, these are two opposite failures that sits between the right way to dress. The hurried gait and the processional gait are the two opposite failures the right gait sits in between. And the pressed voice and the withdrawn voice are the two opposite failures the right voice sits in between. So decorum is what Mesotis looks like once it has come into outward expression. And the perception that lets a man read each single situation correctly is the same phronesis Aristotle gives us as the practical wisdom that governs every other dimension of our moral life. And finally, decorum is also self-sufficient. It is the visible form of the formed man that doesn't really depend on being seen by others. He dresses mostly the same as he does when he is in public. He moves around his house with the same care when no one is watching, and he keeps his table in the same order whether he eats alone or whether he eats with others. Decorum is self-sufficient because it is the form that a life takes and not really the impression a life tries to make. And the Greeks had a name for this. They called it Autarkeia, which means sufficient unto itself. Now, Aristotle says in Book 1 of his Nicomachean Ethics that the eudaimon life is self-sufficient in exactly this sense, which he means that nothing can really be added to it that would suddenly make it more choice-worthy than it already is, and nothing can really be taken away or subtracted from it that would suddenly make it less choice-worthy. Decorum essentially carries the same structure. The form of a serious soul takes when it expresses itself outwardly is already complete. You cannot just add an audience to it and make it more itself, and you also can't take away an audience and make it less itself. This is also why the formed man does not really think about his decorum in the moment. He does not ask whether his bearing is being read correctly by the correct people. He doesn't manage the impression he makes to other people, and he of course doesn't worry about whether the right people are present to see what he actually is. Decorum is simply what his life looks like from the outside. It is there because of what he is, and it endures because of what he is or who he is. Whether others perceive it correctly or not is ultimately secondary to the form itself. In the end, the visible expression of the formed life is for the man who is actually living this life. He inhabits the form and he doesn't somehow perform it. The form just expresses him, what he is, whether or not anyone is watching or anyone is present to receive it, because reception was never really the point of this expression. So the form, ultimately, is not an effect that is produced for others. It is just the outward expression of a life that is already well formed within.